Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. My name is Chantal. Thank you again for joining. This is the final series for the webinar. Just a couple of announcements. Please stay on mute until we open it up towards the end for questions. If you do have questions that come up during the presentation, please put them in the chat box and we will address them at the end. Also, please keep your videos off. If you do have technical issues, again, please put them in the chat box and we will try and address them as quickly as possible.
Sä joudut kuuntelemaan jotain pöpinöitä. Ei tarvitse.
Please, everybody mute yourselves. And so with that, Bettina, I'll hand over to you. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the webinar.
Hello, I am Bettina Shell-Duncan. I'm a biomedical anthropologist at the University of Washington, and for the past 5 years, I've had the honor and pleasure of being a member of the Population Council coordinated and African-led research consortium entitled Evidence to End FGM, Research to Help Girls and Women Thrive. 5 years ago, with generous funding and input from the Department of International Development in the UK, we launched a research initiative to generate evidence on the issue of female genital mutilation cutting with the aim of advancing theories of change and optimizing efforts to accelerate the abandonment of FGM. This program has spanned 7 countries and has produced a wealth of evidence on when, where, and why FGM is practiced, how abandonment can be understood through theories of change, and how interventions might be targeted to optimize and bring about more rapid end to FGM. Today, I'd like to welcome you to the second in our 2-part webinar, using research to understand and accelerate the abandonment of FGM. We will have 2 speakers, each followed by a discussant, and I am pleased to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Dennis Matanda, who is a program officer at the Population Council at in Nairobi. He is experienced in the use of survey data such as DHS and mixed survey data. And together with our other consortium members and under the research program Evidence to End FGM, they used DHS and mixed to map out FGM prevalence and studied possible correlates of FGM, correlates that include child marriage, HIV, AIDS, and fistula. Dr. Matanda has been equally involved in implementation science and operations research and was the principal investigator on the Tracing Change study on FGM, shifting norms and practices among communities in Narok and Kisii counties. Welcome, Dennis.
Thank you, Bettina, for the introduction. So today I'll be presenting on using data to inform programming in 3 countries, that is Kenya, Nigeria, and Senegal. But before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that this work was a collaboration effort between Population Council and Northumbria University. And this work was led by Professor Kandala and with support from other colleagues. So this presentation builds on the thematic area of building the picture on where, when, and why FGM is practiced, and whether we are seeing any changes. So as most of you may be aware, quality data is very key when it comes to decision making, and therefore there's need for evidence by policymakers and program planners, that is in designing interventions to encourage abandonment, and also, most importantly, in directing resources in areas with the greatest needs. Therefore, this consortium made a deliberate effort in using secondary data to generate evidence in trying to build this picture about FGM. Therefore, we used the Bayesian geoadditive modeling techniques to analyze national household survey data for the 3 countries. The Bayesian geoadditive model was very important and necessary because we wanted to account for space and time effects when you're calculating FGM rates. It was also important in explaining heterogeneity, that is FGM prevalence as influenced by factors at individual, household, and also environmental level. So prior analysis have tended to focus on women of reproductive age, that is between 15 to 49 years. Yet in many countries, we know that FGM happens much earlier in life, or the age at cutting has substantially reduced. And therefore, when you focus on women of reproductive age, that is 15 to 49, you don't get a lot of insight when it comes to recent trends. We therefore focused on girls, younger girls, that is 0 to 14 years, to study how their FGM prevalence varied over time by geographic location, and then also looked at some of the associated risk factors. So in mapping hotspots and identifying associated risk factors, we were informed by the reasoning that people who live close to each other are more likely to influence each other's expectations and also kind of like determine what is to be considered appropriate behavior. So in this case, our kind of main outcome variable was either they were cutting their daughters or not. So the demographic and health survey and multiple indicator cluster survey, which I'll refer to as we go along as DHS and MIX, does indeed contain some information about geographic or what you would call spatial information, such as counties, states, or regions where cut girls reside. Also information about their mothers, their households, and also their communities. So we therefore use this information to link individual FGM status to specific geographic areas, while at the same time adjusting for community, individual and also community factors. We also conducted a multi-level analysis using the individual and community variables, and some of the variables, especially those ones at community level, we use them as proxy variables for community norms. I will now share some of the key findings for the 3 countries, beginning with Kenya. Then towards the end, I'll make some concluding remarks, trying to link data, programs, and a little bit on policy. So in Kenya, we used the 4 waves of DHS, that is 1998, 2003, 2008, and 2014. So as you can see in this slide here, where we used maps to map out the hotspot areas, we observed a general decline in FGM prevalence with significant reduction in most of the counties, but also lack of changes in some of the counties. So specifically, 3 counties in the northeastern part of Kenya, that is specifically Mandera, Wajir, and Garissa, registered high prevalence across the years. We also saw, so these counties are bordering Somalia to the east, and also up there, I think Mandera borders Ethiopia. And it's the predominant ethnic group there is the Somali-speaking people. Also in the west or south, kind of like west, we also saw 2 counties, that is Kisii County and Nyamira County, that also posted very high, comparatively high prevalence across the years. These 2 counties are also again predominantly occupied by one ethnic group, the Abagusi. So with regards to the multi-level analysis, we included several variables representing individual and community factors, whose details are in the specific country analysis reports. So here I'm only trying to highlight those variables that were consistently significant in the various models. So we observed that in Kenya, girls whose mothers had no education, those ones whose mothers were Muslims, belong to Kisii or ethnic or Somali ethnic group, and whose mothers had undergone FGM were more likely to be cut. I'll now move to Nigeria. And in Nigeria, we used both demographic and health survey and also multiple indicator cluster survey to study the changes. As you can see here in this slide, we estimated changes in FGM prevalence based on the two most recent surveys. So we used the NDHS of 2013 and the mixed survey of 2016-17. As you can see, the red colorings, southern states such as Oyo, Imo, and Undu saw significant declines in FGM prevalence over the years. On the other hand, we are also hotspots with high FGM prevalence, included Jigawa, Kano, Kaduna, and Zamfara in northwest zone, and around the central there also Ekiti state in southwest zone. Multi-level modeling showed that in Nigeria, a girl's likelihood of being cut increased if a mother was cut or the mother supported FGM continuation. This again suggesting some community level social norms being at play. So in Senegal, we used the 4 waves of DHS 2005 up to 2017. And we just note here is that in Senegal from 2010, they started collecting data, DHS data kind of like on an annual basis, not usually, it usually takes like 5 years. But we only selected those surveys where there were all the variables of interest were included. So that's why we selected some and not others. So as you can see in this slide, so hotspot areas with the highest estimated FGM prevalence were concentrated along Senegal's eastern and southern borders. And here I'm referring to Matam, Tabakunda, and Kolda regions. These showed consistently, as you see the red colorings, showed consistently high FGM prevalence across the years. While regions along the southern border experienced both increases and declines, some fluctuations there, potentially reflecting cross-border migration from high prevalence neighboring countries such as Mali, Guinea, and Guinea-Bissau. With regards to the multi-level analysis, it showed that in Senegal, a girl's likelihood of being cut significantly increased if the mother was from Diola, Mandingwe, Pula, and Soninke ethnicity, if the mother was cut, or the mother supported continuation or believed that FGM was required by religion. Again, this association suggesting possible local social norms and religious norms at play in sustaining FGMC. So as I conclude, so the analysis using DHS and mixed data from Kenya, Nigeria, and Senegal helped us in building the picture on where, when, and why FGM is practiced, and whether we are seeing any changes, especially at the subnational level. We have seen that the prevalence of FGM tends to be concentrated in certain subregions and locations. And therefore, if you were to only consider national level data, then you may you end up masking important local variation of FGM practice. So what this means for programs and policies that by linking this geographic survey data locations, it's possible to identify high prevalence hotspot areas that can benefit from investments and abandonment programs. This is very crucial as we emphasize the importance of subnational policies and also local initiatives to end FGM. Another important point to make is how FGM is also linked to individual and community characteristics in specific areas. For example, belonging to certain ethnic or religious groups, and also the share of cut women within the community. So what this means is that individuals' decisions are more likely to be shaped by common practices among people, especially where they live. And therefore, FGM may persist because of shared expectations and also shared expectations and social or religious groups staying together. Therefore, understanding these dynamics is very important for people who are doing programming and also in terms of like maybe initiating local policies to be able to tackle FGM. And lastly, I think it's also very important to promote initiatives that support gender equality and women empowerment. For example, increasing education attainment and also improving their economic status, because then this will create a climate that empowers women and also reduces demand for FGM in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis. We'll take questions on your talk at the end, and we will right now shift and have some comments by our first discussant, P. Stanley Yoder. Dr. Yoder is a medical anthropologist who's now retired from Macro International, where he worked with the demographic and health survey teams in Africa. And before joining Macro, he was at University of Pennsylvania, directing surveys on health research and impact across Africa. And at Macro, he studied the practice of FGC and analyzed DHS data on FGC. And he also directed a wide variety of other programs related to HIV, malaria, nutrition, family planning, and pregnancy. Welcome, Stan.
Well, hello, Bettina and everybody else. Let me first thank the PUP Council in Nairobi and others for inviting me to participate in this particular event. I'll just reiterate some of the analyses and findings and make some comments on several of the findings in the three countries. The analyses that Professor Kandala and his team did were a real first, because now we can see data from that relate to the higher risk of girls rather than of women. So this is really different from what we've usually seen, although most of the factors associated with higher risks among girls are also those that other studies have found related to the risks of women being cut in general. Kandala and his team, as we know, used a series of multivariate analyses to overcome various drawbacks that stem from sampling techniques to arrive at spatial distribution of FGC prevalence that indicate the importance of geographic location and thus community factors to determining FGC prevalence among daughters. The authors use an adaptation of survival analysis to compensate for the fact that some girls in the survey might, of course, get cut in the future. The overall question that they were trying to answer in their analyses is, using DHS or mixed data, what factors affect the risk that a girl less than 15 years old will be circumcised? And the overall push of these analyses were related to identifying the where and the why, and they have certainly shown us the where. The why hasn't become all that clear quite yet. So now we're looking at FGC data in the three countries, Senegal, Kenya, Nigeria, and Senegal. Oddly enough, they all have a national FGC prevalence of close to 20%, according to the latest surveys. So if we look first at Kenya, as we know, Kenya has been remarkable for the decrease in overall FGC prevalence among women 15 to 49 years of age, from 38% in '98 to 21% in 2014. And all that despite the enduring high prevalence among the Somali population all along the eastern border. The risk of being cut, as Dennis Matanda was explaining, is related to the level of education, Muslim religion, ethnicity, and of course, to the proportion of women cut in the population. The risk of a girl being cut does not vary with the level of education of mothers in Nigeria and Senegal as it does in Kenya. the role of education in Kenya suggests the theory of modernization may explain some of the changes in the practice. Other studies have shown that medicalisation is also part of the change in Kenya. Kandala suggests that a strategy of tailoring programs to county situations should be part of any strategy moving to abandonment. That makes sense to me. In Nigeria is much more complex because of its size and diversity, as well as its variety of types of FGC-related procedures found in the north. There's been an enduring ambiguity about what counts as having been cut. The study in Nigeria found only 2 factors related to a high risk of girls being cut: proportion of mothers locally being cut, as always, and a mother's support of the continuation of the practice. Since the Yoruba and Igbo show higher prevalence than other ethnicities, and they are more Christian than Muslim and more urbanized than many other groups, religion and urban rural residents are not associated with higher risk of getting cut. We should also add that the data from the 2018 DHS, which showed an overall prevalence in Nigeria of 19% among women, is also now available. This survey also showed dramatic decreases of prevalence among Yoruba and Igbo populations. For Yoruba, prevalence declined from 54.5% in 2013 to 34.7% in 1918, and for Igbo, it decreased from 45.2% to 30.7%. These changes, to me, suggest a pattern of modernization similar to what has occurred in Kenya. Finally, a few comments about Senegal. Kandal and his team found that there was just a slight decrease in overall FGC prevalence among women in the period they were looking at. The study examined data from 43,000 girls from the 4 surveys. They found the risks of being cut were higher if a mother thought that her religion supported the cutting and if she supported the continuation of the practice. Of course, ethnicity and proportion of women who've been cut were also significant. Among individual level factors, the study found that place of residence and mother's ethnicity were the main risk factors. In 2017, likelihood of a girl being cut was 50% higher for girls in rural areas. So for the first time now, we do have data for the risk among girls being cut rather than among women, older women. And we find that most of the factors are similar for girls as they were for women. Seeing the analysis of where FGC prevalence is concentrated facilitates the choice of where programs should direct their efforts. It also suggests that programs should be localized and tailored to specific needs of local populations. These analyses have focused on mothers of girls. The needs of these mothers are essentially social and economic, which is why many small programs have focused on women's empowerment. That too makes sense to me. Okay.
Thank you, Stan. We'll take questions on your comments and on Dennis's presentation at the end. And right now, I'm pleased to introduce Nada Waba, who is the project officer for the Evidence to End FGM program in Egypt. She has contributed to several research projects over the past 2 years since she joined the council. She has acted as the principal investigator of the latest mixed method study conducted as part of the program, Understanding the Abandonment of FGMC in Egypt. And prior to joining the council, she obtained a master's degree in anthropology from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Thank you, Nada. Welcome.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'll be presenting our research on gender and FGMC in Egypt, and this is the research that was conducted jointly by the Population Council and by our consultant, Dr. Salma Gael. So I'll be presenting on her behalf today. So the research objectives, we conducted this research to understand the decision-making process when it comes to FGM. So we wanted to understand who makes the decision, what really goes on, what is the process, and also to understand gender attitudes in general of the parents of these girls, and what gender attitudes influence their decision of whether or not to circumcise. We also looked into the parents' background characteristics and whether this influences their decision on whether or not to cut their daughters. So we conducted the study in 3 governorates in Egypt. So Cairo, the capital, one governorate in Upper Egypt, which was Suheg, and one in Lower Egypt, which is Gharbeya. And in Suheg and Gharbeya, we looked in urban and rural areas. We conducted overall 20 focus group discussions with mothers and fathers of girls aged 10 to 14, and the average age of circumcision of girls in Egypt is 10 to 13. So these are girls at the age of circumcision. We also conducted 40 IDIs with mothers, fathers, youth, and community leaders and influencers. And we used a survey of young people in Egypt, DHS, and EHIS for our secondary quantitative analysis. Yeah, so let's just go into the main findings. So these are some findings from the survey of young people in Egypt, and on the far left you can see attitudes on education, for example. So you can see that 35% of men believe that educating boys is more important than educating girls, while 21% of women believe so. And on the far right you can see attitudes when it comes to obedience. So this is you can see that 78% of men believe that a woman must obtain her spouse's approval before doing anything, and 74% of women believe so as well. And this is what really we have found even in our qualitative study, is that the issue of obedience is very, very common. Issues such as education and employment are, they're still problematic, but they're much less. They're much more controversial. If we can go to the next slide. So we found, for example, that while a lot of the parents agreed that maybe girls should be educated just as much as their sons, and they should, have employment opportunities, this was all controversial. What was a common thread that we found is that parents are very likely to believe, for example, that girls should have curfews, that they should choose their friends, and this all comes from this idea that girls should be obedient, that girls should be controlled, that they're in need of protection. So this, for example, is a father in Cairo that was saying, yes, of course we have to have a say in who our daughter befriends. We need to know who she is, who her family is, and he was saying that boys, can have friends from the streets, that he should be involved, but not as much as his involvement in his daughter's life. And this is the same father that was saying that the danger of not cutting the girl is that her husband will not be able to control her. So, without going into much detail on gender norms, because there was a lot of details on this in the qualitative analysis, but basically what we have found is this underlying sentiment that girls should be obedient, controlled, and need of protection. This is what also drives drives circumcision in many of the cases. Next slide, please. Yeah, let's just go into that. So when it comes to decision making, we found that women still handle a lot of the logistics. So we always hear that FGM is a woman's issue, and it's true that women handle most of the logistics, that they take the girl to be circumcised, that they ask around about who can circumcise their daughters. But increasingly, they're having also to take their husband's permission, because we have a high rate of medicalisation, and husbands are sometimes involved with paying for the procedure. Next slide, please. We're also seeing that parents are increasingly hesitant. So mothers in specific, they're very confused because they're getting mixed messages over the past decades. You know, the first quote is from a mother in rural Gharbia saying that she's confused, should she do it for her or not? And what they do is basically they just take them to a doctor to decide. A lot of, and this is very, very common. So this is a father in urban Gharbia saying that, rural Gharbia saying that, I take my daughter to an OBGYN close to where we live and pay for the checkup. He examines her and determines whether she needs to circumcise or not. So this whole idea of the need for circumcision is also very, very common in Egypt, increasingly common. Next, please. What we have found is that while mothers are the main decision makers, it seems that if either of the parents wants to abandon, it's likely that the girls won't be cut. So we found this in FGDs and IDIs, that, for example, 2 mothers refused to cut their daughters, whereas their husbands were supportive of the practice, and both women seem to have won the argument and managed to make the final decision on abandonment. So it seems that circumcision is sometimes sort of a non-decision, something that actually just happens. And if one of the parents is, you know, for abandonment and argues for it, well, that it's likely that the girl won't be abandoned, won't be cut. Next, please. And we've also found this the other way around, you know. So if mothers are for it and fathers are against it, then, you know, the father will win the argument, and, you know, vice versa. And we've also found that increasingly girls are feeling entitled to have a say. So we always believe that girls don't really influence decision, and this is, you know, very much true. But we're seeing that that they're increasingly more likely to try at least and fight back. So this was a girl from Cairo, for example, who was saying that I was 16, 17 when my mother said, let's go to the doctor. I told her no one will examine me. She kept asking why. And I told her that any doctor who would think of doing this to me, I'd send them to prison. This is illegal and unhealthy. So girls are becoming a bit more aware. They're still not very influential, but they are fighting back a bit more. Next, please. However, they are usually not told that they will be circumcised. So even if they want to fight back and if they are against it, sometimes, a lot of the times, we found that they are taken to the doctor without really telling them what they're going to do. So this was a girl in rural Gharbia who was saying that she only found out what was happening when she got to the place of circumcision. Only then did I make the link between the ads that I had been seeing on TV and what was about to happen. I tried to fight back. I said no, but they were holding me down. So while there is awareness, there's growing awareness, increasing awareness on FGM. A lot of these girls sometimes they don't really make the link, but between what they see on TV and you know, going to a doctor's office, because sometimes it's not really portrayed in its most current medicalized form. So they don't really make the link that this is what circumcision is. They don't find out until they get to the doctor's office. Next, please. We found that the most influential factors that really determine whether or not a girl will be circumcised is the mother's circumcision status. So we found that mothers who had been cut were 49 times more likely to cut their daughters. Also, mothers who believe that FGM is a religious requirement were 5 times more likely to cut their daughters. And we've also found that education level is very influential. The mother's education level in specific, especially when they are educated above a secondary stage. This also makes circumcision less likely. And we've also found that personal experience is very, very important. So aside from the characteristics of the parents, if they have gone through a negative experience, they're likely, they could be strong opposers of the practice. So this goes for mothers as well as fathers. So fathers, for example, if their wives were sexually cold and you know, sometimes they can be against the practice. So this, for example, was the case of a father who was against cutting his daughter as he got married twice, and in his first marriage, his wife was sexually cold because of FGM. So he decided that he didn't want to do this to his daughter. This is, of course, not always the case. Sometimes husbands don't even realize that their wives are cut. Sometimes they want them to be a little bit less responsive during sex, but some fathers we have found were against abandonment because they have had a negative experience. Next, please. And mothers, they basically, their negative experience is more about the difficult cutting experience, and a lot of mothers that we found that were against the practice and that, you know, were arguing against it were those who went through a difficult cutting experience, that they didn't want their girls to go through the same thing, or the second mother who was saying that I have sexual coldness, I don't feel anything, it's causing me and her husband psychological problems. Should I cut my daughter and cause her the same problems that I have? So this is also a matter of personal experience. Next, please. Yeah, and just to conclude, so basically it's crucial to address gender attitudes on women needing to be obedient, controlled, and that the perception that they are weak. We have found that this is a sentiment that still largely exists, and it is one of the driving forces of the practice. Both men and women can be key decision makers about FGMC, although, you know, women are much more involved. Either of them can have the final call. Messaging should be targeted also towards daughters, although they're currently not influential. We're seeing that they're more likely to fight back and they're becoming more aware. And also drawing on personal experience for both men and women can prove to be a strong tool in convincing parents not to cut their daughters. Thank you.
Thank you, Nada. We will take questions for Nada and our previous speakers at the end. But first, I would like to introduce our second discussant. Our second discussant is Dr. Nafi Diop. Dr. Diop is the Chief of Gender and Human Rights Branch at UNFPA. She holds a PhD in demography and population studies from the University of Montreal and is originally from Senegal. Previously, she was the senior UNFPA advisor and coordinator of the joint program with UNICEF for eliminating FGM in 17 African and Middle Eastern countries, where UNFPA supports anti-FGM efforts by government and civil society organizations. Welcome, Nafi.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for inviting me. I would like to start by really congratulating the researcher from this consortium, you know, Evidence to End FGM. A lot of the research that were generated over the past 4 years have been really useful to look again at how we are programming and question ourselves, challenge ourselves to address more specifically some of the emerging results and emerging lessons learned from your consortium. So thank you so much for that. I would like just to say that, of course, the presentation that was made is short, but the research are very, very strong and with a lot of insights from Egypt, actually, that I visited several times last year. And you know, this issue of decision making was quite interesting from and this role between women's you know, grandmother, mother-in-law, aunt, but also the men, and the kind of silent role, but strong economic role behind, and the emerging role of the doctor, medical doctor, as a decision maker. So we all know that Egypt has a high medicalization of FGM, with medical doctor, you know, mostly performing this, you know, this practice. And it has always been a big question, you know, how are we going to, you know, break that trend and how are we going to really to ensure that not only the girls will be and will not go through the practice of FGM as a whole, but also that medical doctors are going to be agent of change and instead of perpetrator. So, all those information, the decision, the discussion on the spouse, and that decision on when one of the spouse is not supportive, but the other one is supportive, and who exactly, and what is happening, what is the outcome for the girl is quite fascinating, without a clear conclusion on, for programmatic reason where we need to act more at the woman level or at the man level, but is still creating and bringing out interesting information. And then the girls of the voice, the voice of the girls themselves, who in a lot of spaces are in power decision making somewhere, because the practice is done when she's she's a teenager, early teenager. And so she also has a voice where that also supports, the work that we are doing within schools and within the youth, groups, etc. So religions is quite important, education, and we all know, that those are, factors that can be, improving the abandonment or non-abandonment of the practice. I would like to say just that, of course, we need to recognize more and more that, FGM is rooted in gender inequities, and that FGM is linked to the low value of girls and women. And this is what this result is telling us. And that our approach to programming need to be also look at more carefully with those this kind of results. We know that, of course, men benefit most clearly, but adolescent boys also have a stake in norms that deal that deal them a better hand than girls. More power, more freedom, better access to resources, and the promise of substantially more power in adulthood. We also, understand now that older women can also have a stake if they benefit from the prestige associated with having adult sons, or from having a daughter-in-law to share or take on the burden of domestic chore. So we really need to, understand that people often misperceive how far they benefit from existing gender norms, and and see these inequalities as natural and unable to be changed. So, for example, in the area of female genital mutilation, particularly, we see that women that are living in practicing communities have their own logic and rational reasons for not readily adopting our logic. I mean, I'm using the quotes of our logic. For them, living under a strong patriarchal society, social and economic regime with very few options for choices in livelihood, the room for negotiating a limited amount of power is extremely small. Cutting a daughter and complying with other certain social norms, particularly around sexuality and its link to the economics of reproduction, is an essential requirement to this silent power negotiation. Women instinctively know this. We may scare them with all the possible risk of FGM to health. We may bring religious leaders to persuade them that the practice is not a requirement. We can try to bring the wrath of the law to bear upon them. But in their desperate hold on the little negotiated power they have known for centuries, they are not willing to let go unless they see a benefit that is equal to or more than what they already have. So I think that those are, you really think that we need to reflect on a little bit more and see how we should adjust our programming we are seeing in a lot of cases programs addressing the elimination of FGM being really gender blind and focusing on FGM need to end, your daughter will die, your this and that is not a good thing, blah, 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 etc., but not addressing the root causes of inequality and trying really to transform this, you know, some of these harmful gender norms and power relation. And so the big question that we may have and that I can have at the end was really until which level a program addressing and trying to address the abandonment of FGM should take into account, you know, gender transformation and what exactly that means, you know, in terms of investment, in terms of resources, in terms of timing, etc. We have seen, and that I think data are backing up the fact that FGM is decreasing globally and in most rapidly in some countries than in others, which is a good thing. But also we know that you know, sometimes, you know, the social norm approach that has been used as a collective process of abandonment of FGM did not address the root causes of gender inequalities. So we can reach the abandonment of FGM and declarations of abandonment without addressing the root gender norms. And so I think that all the programs now need to look more carefully at that element and make sure that we are putting in place, you know, a more gender approach and more transformative approaches, because the same girl that is going through FGM, that is not going to be sent to school or withdraw from school, the first opportunity, like the COVID-19 now that we are living, it's the same girl that is going to get married because of the, you know, the need for economic, you know, means for the family, and the same one, etc. So it's a you know, the program can make strong progress in making sure that people understand that the FGM is harmful, but we don't know if this is going to be sustained also if we are not addressing the value of the girl herself. So I'm calling here for all the programmatic people who are probably connected, that it's important to look at this area and questions how we are in the continuum of gender. How are we taking, looking at those issues? I've seen over the years, you know, programs addressing FGM that are really gender unequal and are perpetuating gender inequalities. I've seen others who are completely gender blind, others who are a little bit gender responsive, but have rarely seen programs which are, you know, really strongly gender transformative, you know, in our approach to abandonment of FGM. So I will just finish and end, I mean, conclude by saying that when we need to, of course, revisit our engagement of men and boys in our programs and our work. And we need to look at the, you know, the role of, you know, the religious leaders, the medical doctors or health workers and all, and ensure that really we are using, you know, some of the, you know, gender vision and approach, and how exactly we need to integrate, you know, this issue of inequalities between, you know, women and men and gender roles and power relation into our programming to ensure that we will have a sustained abandonment of FGM, and that in 2030 we will have reach the 0 cases of FGM. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Nafi. I'm going to open this up now for taking some questions. So I'm going to open this up now to taking some of the questions that have appeared in the chat box, and then open up the questions a little bit more broadly. Dennis, during your presentation, a question was asked by Corinne Whitaker, and who comments that during the COVID-19 pandemic, schools are being shut in Somalia, as well as in communities beyond the Somali border that are ethnically Somali, refugee camps and otherwise. And and this poses risk for girls who are being taken out of school, which is a refuge. And what can be done with these data to address these bigger concerns?
Thank you, Bettina. I think it's a big question, especially given that we don't know so much about COVID. But I think it's a good question, given the many interventions that programs have been doing. And just looking at what we have done so far, and stepping, of course, data is important, but I just wanted to step away from DHS and all this data that we have and look at some of other findings that we got. We have had studies that have looked at countries that border each other, especially in terms of implementation of the law, also issues in terms of like how interventions are effective in preventing people from conducting FGM. And to me, the issue of COVID is just an example of an opportunity that has presented itself among communities where now you don't have interventions happening, and now they go back. And to me, that speaks to how effective have interventions been, given all these years that you are trying to intervene. And also speaks to inter-country. So for example, if you have interventions in Kenya among the Somalis, as you can see during the DHS presentation that I was making, at the border between Somalia and Kenya, these are almost the same people. And therefore, if you have interventions happening in Kenya alone and not happening in Somalia, or if you have issues about law being implemented in Kenya and not being implemented in Somalia, then, and you're dealing with the same people, it becomes difficult if countries are not collaborating, but also in terms of interventions. What are people intervening? Are they speaking to the root causes, as Nafi has said, so that people can really stop cutting? Because to me, COVID is just an opportunity for people to go back to where what they used to do. But if we had done more interventions, then that will work. So maybe to just conclude is that I think there's need to people to start refocusing, maybe questioning some of their approaches when it comes to interventions, looking at the theories of change, what exactly do they want to change, and is it effective over a long period of time? And then just last comment, I think in terms of data, given the COVID-19 situation at the moment, you really can't go to communities, and people need to start thinking about how innovative can we be, and probably using online or mobile phones to conduct some little bit of data generation in communities so that we can see what is really happening. Then how does that feed to programs that we can try to help these people not to continue cutting their daughters.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And I have a question, or I have a series of questions for Nada as well. And I'll capture it with a question by Elise that sort of touches on several of the different questions. She asks, if girls and women are perceived as weak, why do they need so strong measures of control? And in which way is FG seen to facilitate men's control over their wives? So getting back to this issue of empowerment.
So the idea that women are viewed as weak, well, I mean, this first of all makes them easier to control. I mean, it's not that they need, I mean, apart from that they need more control, it's just it makes them easier to control. So a lot of what we found is that, you know, participants didn't want, for example, unwanted sexual relations between, in the community. And it was much easier to sort of control women and make sure that they abide by these rules than it is easier for them to do so for their sons. So this is the idea. I mean, this is association between them being perceived as weak, and also just that they're easier to control, and that they need sort of protection. So what we've found is that a lot of the participants believe that if their daughters, if they're not circumcised, they will not be able to control themselves sexually. They will not be able to protect themselves. So it's this sort of also sort of instinct that they want to protect their daughters. So because also they see them as weak. Yeah. So and for husbands that if FGM facilitates the control of their wives, I mean, it's basically kind of the chicken and the egg kind of thing, because the idea that men's sexual desires are more important and are taken more into consideration comes from, in the first place, that men have more control. So it's not really one that leads to another. It's sort of this this concept that girls' sexual desires are not very important. That men have more of a say, and even those who choose to abandon the practice, this is also kind of driven by men's desires. So this is the idea that. And this is also kind of what drives medicalisation, because a lot of the participants, they want to go to visit a medical professional, because the doctors can sort of cut a small bit of the clitoris, for example, or of the labia, but then they don't cut everything. But this is also seen to be in the interest of men, because some men are complaining that they don't want their wives to be cold, but they also don't want their wives to be, to have too much desire or too much libido. So even this whole thing with medicalisation, the increasing medicalisation, we have 73% of medicalisation, 73% of women aged 19 and under in Egypt cut by medical professionals, and this is also partly driven by this need to make sure that men are comfortable within their sexual relations, that their wives are not too cold, and they're not have too much. Yeah. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, Nada. We have more questions in the comment box. I invite our speakers to look in the chat box at the comments. And in the meantime, I want to turn to Dr. Jacinta Strawn, who is an expert on gender equality and human rights and reproductive health, and has been the director of our consortium directed by the Population Council for the past 5 years. Welcome, Jacinta.
Thank you, Bettina. I assume you're inviting me on at this point because you're closing the meeting. Because my words were really to say a really big thank you. Thank you to you, Bettina, but I also want to take this brief moment to thank all of you who have joined the webinar today, as well as those who joined last week or also on the webinar. The webinar marks the conclusion of the FGMC research program. And so there's appreciation for those who have come on today as discussants, because it's your generosity to give your time and provide insights and raise additional questions that has given all of us, I think, much food for thought today, leaving here today. The Population Council led this consortium beginning in 2015, and we worked with a group of individuals, experts, as well as institutions that included the Africa Coordinating Center for the Abandonment of Female Genital Mutilation in Kenya, ACAV, AFAD University for Women in Sudan, the Global Research and Advocacy Group in Senegal, Manion Daniels based in the UK, Population Reference Bureau, University of Washington, Bettina, University of California, as well with Jerry Mackey. And as been mentioned by some of our speakers, there were also individuals and other institutions upon whom we drew to expand the global evidence base that we were tasked with working on. So the work we've done is intended to inform interventions in the different contexts in which we've worked. And those interventions are not just around programming, but also around policies, as well as investments that would strengthen this work. So our portfolio has been a total of something like 47 research studies. And so this second webinar is marking the completion of that research project's work. So I really do want to express my appreciation, as well as the consortium's collective appreciation for all the insights, discussions, the reviews, the support, the opportunities that many of you who are on this webinar have in fact enabled through the partnerships and collegial relationships that we've had with many of you. So as we sign off today, one of the things that we will do is, of course, provide you with links to our body of work and evidence, and we hope that you'll come to it and look at it, as well as the slides that have emerged out of our 2 webinars. So we encourage you to access those sites and continue to interact with us going forward as we seek to deliver on SDG 5.3 that accelerates the abandonment of really all forms of harmful practices, including, of course, FGM. So thank you very, very much for joining us. And I wish you safety and well-being as you go forward from this meeting today. Thank you, Bettina.
Thank you all.
That concludes the end of our webinar. As Jacinta has mentioned, all these materials, both for webinar 1 and webinar 2, will be made available to all participants. And if you do have any questions, I will also make that any other that pending will be addressed in the materials that we share. I wish you all a good evening, a good day, and we'll see each other when we see each other. Goodbye.